Welcome to the WebYeshiva's series on the Pesach Seder. I am Gidon Rothstein, and we're going to be learning about Shulchan Orech, about the Seder meal, and what role the Seder meal plays in the Pesach Seder. Meaning, if you think about it, we have this big meal, and we have this big event, and we start off, and we have Kiddush, and we have a lot of talking, and then we have Chametz, and we have matzah and maror, and then we have a korech, and then we have a meal. And the meal, so in my family, always, we had like things we would say, maybe we'll get to that during the meal. We would like push it off. We can't talk about that now. It's too much. We'll talk about it during the meal. So that's what we did. Like the meal was like where we like catch all. And then when we got to the meal, we just had a regular Yontif meal. So I want to think about what that meal is and what's the role of the meal during the course of the Pesach Seder. So if you look at source number 1, the Rambam in Hilchot Chametz Matzah says, and this I'm sharing it because I think it's important to think about in terms of the meal itself and what it says to us about the meal. So it's the Rambam says, "Bechol dor vador chayav adam leharot et atzmo ki'ilu hu be'atzmo yatsa ata mishibud Mitzrayim." In every generation, a Jew is required to see him or herself as if he left. Now, that word ata, what does that word ata mean? You can feel free to chat into the chat box. It's the easiest way for me to sort of know that people are joining and enjoying and part of it. What does that word ata mean?
Right now.
It means right now, exactly right. Right now. So it's not that we're trying to revive the memory of Yetziat Mitzrayim according to the Rambam. It's that we've been spending the evening trying to revive the experience. And when I get to the meal, and what does it make the Rambam think so? Shnei Amar, because when Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking in Devarim, he's addressing a generation who didn't leave Mitzrayim. How do you know that generation didn't leave Egypt? The people he's talking to in Devarim. How do we know they didn't leave Egypt? Because the whole book of Devarim is addressed to the generation that's going to enter the land of Israel. And the generation, exactly. Somebody said in the chat box, right? I don't name names on the recording. And somebody said in the chat box, right? Because everybody died in the desert. And yet Moshe Rabbeinu says to them, Ve'otanu hotzi misha. Right? God took out of there. And the Rambam says, Al davar zetziva HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem commanded us, V'zacharta, again in Devarim. You have to remember, Ki ever ayita, that you were a slave. Klamar, Ki ilu ata be'atzmacha. So this is what it means is, we're supposed to get to the stage that we experience it, that we ourselves were in Egypt. Not just we were in Egypt, and therefore I remember I was in Egypt. We were in Egypt, and now I got out. V'yatzata lacherut v'nifteita. And you went free, and you were redeemed. So that's the first step. So, and then the next halacha in the Rambam is going to be about the meal. So one first place that the meal plays in is the meal, ideally, is the expression of what we've gone through. Meaning, I spent Kadesh, Orchatz, Karpas, Yachatz, Magid, Rochza, Motzi, Matzah, Maror, Korech, right? I spent all of those, hopefully, getting myself to the stage that I am now a Jew who just left Egypt. So the meal I'm eating is like theoretically and ideally a celebratory meal of having just gotten out of Egypt, right? Lefichach, the Ram says, source number 2, Lefichach, kishesoed adam balayla hazeh tzarich le'achol v'lishtot v'hu meiseiv derech cherut. Now we're going to get to it, I think, we today don't care so much about haseba, about leaning, because times change and customs change and practices change. It's not so urgent. But the point about the haseba for the Rambam is, it's not that I lean. So when I was growing up, everybody said, we lean because we want to show that we're free. But for the Rambam's presentation, it's a little more than that. It's not I want to show that I'm free. It's I want to show that I just got free. Right? And everybody has to have 4 cups of wine. Now, the Rambam is placing it in the same paragraph as the idea that we just left Egypt. That's because the Gemara talks about the fact that the 4 cups of wine are also meant as expressions of cherut. Now, cherut, we often translate as freedom, but it's in this context, it's not just the freedom, it's the sense of having just been set free. And just being set free, that leaves us open to drink more and to drink as much as we want. So that's the 4 cups of wine. And then the next halakha, so number 2, the second line, towards the end of the line, Afilu anishim Yisrael lo yochal ad sheyesei. Even the poorest Jew has to, now again, it's not specifically the leaning. Even the poorest Jew has to lean. It's true, that's what it says, but the point is, why do we say that now? What is it? What's the significance or the importance of saying that even the poorest Jew has to lean? Because the leaning isn't about your actual station in life. The leaning is about the extent to which one has managed to cultivate the sense of having just left Egypt. And for that celebration, poverty, wealth doesn't matter. Now, Isha, the Rambam says, right? Women don't have to, and that's because for women in the time of the Gemara, leaning didn't mean anything. But the Rambam says, following the Gemara, following the Talmud, and if she's a very important woman, so she has to lean. Right? And children, sons, adult sons with their fathers, they're supposed to lean because they're supposed to. Now, usually, a child has an obligation towards both parents of what's called morah, of what's called awe or fear. So usually that would preclude this casual leaning. Now, we today have we parent in a different way today than they did, but there's supposed to be an element of morah, of fear or awe in the child's relationship to a parent. By child, I don't mean a child like a minor, a child just having been birthed by somebody, so having been sired or parented by somebody. For this purposes, it doesn't matter. Why doesn't it matter for this purpose? Again, because it's not about that you're actually demonstrating, it's that you're experiencing something. However, Talmid B'fnei Rabo Eino Meisei, Elim Ken Natan Lo Rabo L'Rishut. But with a student in front of a teacher, in front of a Torah teacher, so there you need permission from the Torah teacher, because that relationship is different. It has other elements of it. That's a conversation for another time. But now the Rambam says, when does this haseba take effect? When is it important? What's it there for? So he says, Bishat achilat kizayit matzah, when we eat the matzah, ubishtiat arba kosot, and when we have the 4 kosot. Now those we understand because those are part of the actual Seder, right? I would have thought to say, that's the real stuff, right? That's the stuff where we're really celebrating having left Egypt. But for all the rest of the eating, it's appropriate and proper to lean. So why? Because if we've succeeded, if we've succeeded at cultivating in ourselves and developing in ourselves this sense of ourselves as having just left Egypt, so that we would want to lean into it as an expression of that. It's not the way Chazal set up the rules, but that's the way it would go. So the first step, we're going to move on from the Rambam very quickly. But the first step is the Rambam's idea. The Seder is not as much about commemorating the Exodus. It's much more about re-experiencing the Exodus and getting ourselves to the point that we can actually feel like we just left Egypt. And one of the ways we demonstrate that is the physical presentation we have when we eat and drink. Certainly the foods that are specific to the Seder. So the wine is a food specifically of celebration and of the sense of freedom. The matzah is certainly a food of the celebration of freedom. So in those times when we are re-experiencing it, we certainly must lean. And then when it comes to other parts of the meal as well, that began to change. I hinted and I implied before in the time of the Ashkenazi Jewry. So by then they didn't sit in the same ways. They didn't eat in the same way. So the Hagot Maimoniot, number 4, the Hagot Maimoniot is an Ashkenazic commentary on the Rambam. It's not quite a commentary. It's sort of like what the Ramah does for the Shulchan Orech, adds in Ashkenazic customs. Nagot Maimoniot was earlier than the Ramah. Nagot Maimoniot on the Rambam will say things like what the Maharam of Rutenberg would say on this issue. Maharam of Rutenberg was a very important Ashkenazic rabbi of the late 1200s. So Yaakov Maimonides was one of his students, and he wrote onto the Rambam sort of for example, if instead of the Shulchan Orech become the Shulchan Orech, if the Rambam had become the Shulchan Orech, meaning the Rambam had become the book that everybody used for the definition of their Judaism, the Hagor Maimonides would have done for us what the Ramah really did. He would have told us this is what Ashkenazic Jewry did. So he reports for us that the Rebbe Avya, that's the Rav Yah, is an important 12th century Rishon in Germany. Katav she'inanu tzrichim haseba. He said we don't have to lean anymore. Why not? Bisman hazeh sherei b'nei chare inan misubim. Because the symbolism of leaning, right, is gone. But Nagos says, Amnam Yechidahi. We don't really follow that. That's not the common custom. That's what he held. It's still gonna be important for us, as you'll see in a minute, but that's what he held. So today, if somebody said to me, do I have to lean today? So the first step is to remember leaning is a rabbinic rule. It's not a biblical rule, but rabbinic rules are very important too. Then you say, and there's a small minority opinion that says that because times have changed, so we don't have to lean anymore. So when we reject that, meaning that I decided I want to reject it, when the halakhic consensus decided they're not going to follow that view. So think for a minute, what is that saying about leaning? Is leaning a demonstration of freedom by the person? Why or why not? Let me let you think about it before I just, drone on. Is leaning a demonstration of freedom? If nobody around me leans, free or slave, anybody, they don't lean when they're eating, right? No, there's no more lying on couches. And all of a sudden, I'm going to make sure to grab the pillows and get an armchair and lean. So what am I doing? What do I mean by that? So it shows you're standing and feeling. So that's what somebody says to me in the chat box. It shows you're standing and feeling, which I get. But and certainly that's true. My point is, though, that it means that we are letting what in the time of the Gemara was an actual expression of freedom, right? When the Gemara said everybody leans, it's because in the Gemara's time, truly free people lean. Okay. So when they said to do it, it meant that it could have meant two things, but it meant at least that I adopt the posture that free people do. Okay. But nowadays, I'm adopting a posture that nobody around me does. So it means that leaning has turned into an artificially, and I mean now, it wasn't when it was created, but it's an artificial practice for the purpose of making a point, which is fine. And that's what the halacha argues, the halacha accepts, but that's what we're doing. We are making a point of leaning. So we say, because free people lean. So what? So we don't actually mean free people lean. We mean free people used to lean. So what? So I think the so what is that because one of our goals on this night is to not only remember that we left Egypt, but to re-experience it, we therefore adopted something that we say, okay, this is a way that I can, because otherwise we're left with no deep physical way to demonstrate in our posture, in our presentation, our sense of ourselves is freer and as having just experienced freedom, which can be uncomfortable because we're not used to. Exactly true. It can be uncomfortable because we're not used to. I fully agree. And that's what we seem to be doing. Okay. Look at number 5 now, the Kiryat Sefer. The Kiryat Sefer was a book by the Mabit, where he took the Rambam and he told us the sources, and he sort of summarized the Rambam's halachos and that he put there. So he says, mitzvah mem. The mitzvah that the Rambam talks about is l'saper b'nesim v'niflaot shenasu l'avoteinu b'Mitzrayim, be'oto alay l'shetvat b'Nisan, to recount the miracles done to our forefathers in Egypt on the 15th of Nisan. And even though, right, normally we think it's for the children, even if we are very knowledgeable Torah scholars, we have to be involved with. Now, notice the Mabit says, "Behilchot Pesach ad chatzot," the laws of Pesach, meaning he's not even so sure we necessarily have to focus on the story itself. And he says, because when we talk about the wise son, notice the thing the wise son asked about, which we're so excited about, is he asked about the various laws. So the Mabit is telling us that he thinks, and the Briskers were known to think about this as well, that they thought that the laws of the Pesach Seder, discussing those laws, was another good avenue to a full telling of the story. which is not our topic tonight, so I'm not going to get there. But it is helpful in terms of if you're thinking about, I think a lot about what your table conversation will be. Now, I have to say, I expect this year at my Seder, we've got a whole bunch of different people from different kinds of backgrounds, different kinds of perspectives. So I think that the odds that we'll spend a lot of time talking about the laws in detail are very minimal. But I think what the Mabit was getting at, which Brisker's later fastened on and adopted as well, was that by a thorough study of the laws of Pesach, we also are sort of forced into or drawn into a recognition of where we are, why we're there, what happened, and that it gets us to the same result in a slightly different path. Then he quotes from the Rambam as well, the Choldor right? We had lirot, right? He has l'harot, to act in ways that show as if we left Egypt. Shneimar ve'otanu yitzim misham, right? This is for the Rambam, and then the Zachar Tigerei Misham, Klomar. Now notice, as I did on the next line, the Mabit doesn't talk about that I left this year. But the Rambam seemed to say that we're supposed to remember and we're supposed to feel and experience it as if I just left. Now, it could be the Mabit just left out the word, not picking up on it, but thought the same thing. Or it could be that if the Mabit was fine, if I thought to myself, I'm going to experience it as if I left 5 years ago, but not just left. So it could be. Now the Rambam says, the mitzvah says, all of this, he says, is part of telling the story. I would have thought telling a story is about telling a story. So the Mabit is saying, no, I think figuring out the halachos, right, and demonstrating it in some physical way and feeling like I just left, that's all part of the Seder. So that's going to focus us on the meal too, because that's the meals where we're going to do it. That's where we do a lot of our leaning and a lot of our expressing of it. So let's talk about that leaning a little bit more. Number 6, the Shulchan Orech says, Isha inat tzricha heseva, elim kini chashuva, which saw the Rambam as well, that women don't have to lean unless they're important women. Now look at what the Ramah does in the next line. The Ramah says, Haga, v'chol anashim shalanu mikrei chashivot. Step 1 is, he says, you know what? Our Ashkenazic women, they're all considered important. Now that theoretically should have meant, what should that have meant? If we say, what did the Shulchan Orech just say that should mean that should have meant that this line would have been important for them? If all Ashkenazic women count as important, then I would have thought that all Ashkenazic women must lean. Correct. So the Rambam says, the Ramah says, the next step, Achlo nahagu lehaseh, but that's not the custom. Ki samchu al Raviyah, because they rely on the Raviyah. What did the Raviyah say? The Raviyah was the one who said, right? What did the Raviyah say? The Raviyah said, well, since people don't lean nowadays, then it's not really a sign of Cherus anymore. But remember that already long before the Ramah, the Agot Maimoniot had said, that's an individual opinion. So how did it get revived? And the Ramah doesn't revive it for the men. The Ramah revives it for the women. So what is he saying? Now you might think he's saying, I don't think women need to lead. But he's not saying that because the Ramah also said what the Shulchan Orech did not say. The Ramah said, all our Ashkenazic women, they're called chashuvot. Well, if they're called chashuvot, if they're called important, then the Rambam had said, the Shulchan Orech had said, important women lean just like the men lean. And that's because back at the time of the Gemara, when we said a woman was important, what it meant was she was wealthy enough or politically powerful enough or whatever it was, that she partook of polite society, of upper class society. And in upper class society, you lean. So that's what that should have been the consequence. If we're saying women partake of society fully, as they do by the time of the Ramah in Ashkenazi communities. So what's he saying? So I think it's this idea, this Shulchan Orech thing is causing us a headache a little bit. Because while we said correctly, we said everything we said tonight, I think people have gotten right. That it's a way to stimulate ourselves with certain feelings. It's a way to portray certain feelings, right? And to get us to the certain feelings. At the same time, it's uncomfortable because we're not used to it. As somebody said, right? We don't, it's not like it really makes us feel freer. It's a little bit annoying. It's not simple eating, leaning left, especially because we don't lie down, right? And there are times they lay to the left and they ate. Maybe that would be easier. When I'm leaning on an armchair with a couple of pillows there, I'm like this, and so the Ramah is saying we don't feel a need, meaning even though we in Ashkenazic circles have come to see our women as full members of society with the men, and therefore that should have meant they should have to lean. But we are also clear enough that leaning is a questionable practice that we're not going to require it of them. Okay? Now, moving on in the number 7, the Mishnah Berurah, he says, Gehilel, this is about the Korech sandwich. So we had the telling of the Pesach story. After we tell the story, we drink the second cup of wine. Then we wash and we eat matzah and we eat maror. And then after matzah and maror, we put them together. Right? So when we talk about that, we say in the Haggadah, this is Zecher LeMikdash Gehilel, right? This is a commemoration of what Hillel used to do in the time of the Mikdash, of the temple. Vanuscha etlinu b'Haggadah, says the Mishnah Berurah, Kina sa Hillel bizman shebeit hamikdash haya kayam. Haya korech matzah maror ve'ochlam biyachad. V'yesh kadvush shetzirk lo haya lomar haya korech pesach matzah maror. So there's a debate about what Hillel did, and I think about this because this is a big part of our meal, right? It's I don't know about you, but by the time I get to the dinner part of the Pesach Seder, I'm often reasonably full because I've had 2 cups of wine and 2 olives worth of matzah, and then an olive's worth of maror, and then an olive's worth of matzah along with, with the maror. That's a lot of food. So this food is the sandwich. So why do we sandwich them together? And how does that affect our experience of freedom? Because part of what I was trying to point out was, according to the Rambam, the idea that we are now feeling free shapes lots of things in our Seder. It shapes our leaning and in our eating as well, because the regular way we do it is, so somebody has to make compromise and balance, which I think is a good point, right? So the regular way it is, we have the matzah experience. Now, matzah is a tooth experience thing. And that's truth is when my children were little, I used to say it this way. I don't think they ever loved it, but I always loved it. I used to point out that at the Seder, we do a magic trick with the matzah. Because at the beginning of the Seder, we talk about the matzah, we say, Holach Ma'anya, this is the lechem of poverty, right? This is the poor man's bread that we ate in Egypt. And at the end of the Magid, we say Rabbi Gamliel tells us we have to say 3 things at the Seder, and one of them is matzah. And then we say, why do we eat matzah? We eat matzah because God took us out of Egypt so quickly, we didn't have time for the matzah to rise and become bread. So we've switched the matzah from it being a commemoration of poverty and slavery into a commemoration of the moment of being set free. So when we eat matzah at the Seder, maybe we're doing both, or we're doing only one or the other, but we're doing something. When Hillel says, I think that the verse says, Al matzot morim yochlu, that at the very least means that for him, that we have to put them together. Now, maror is clearly a commemoration of what? It puts us in the mind frame of, it's in the name, right? It's clearly about and this is the reason we don't lean for the maror. For the maror, we don't lean for sure because the maror is about, it's about the slavery and the bitterness of the slavery. So if I say I'm going to eat matzah to remember the freedom, let's say, or maybe the freedom with a memory of the slavery, and then I'm going to eat maror separately to commemorate the slavery and the bitterness of it, and then I'm going to eat Pesach, right? Some of the meat, God willing. Not looking good for this year, but God willing, soon we will have a Pesach Seder and we'll be able to eat the Korban Pesach, and we eat the meat of the lamb or the goat that we chose to roast that night, right? As part of the Seder, as part of the sacrifice, right? What's that doing for us? So that's reminding us of the moment when God took us out. If we experience each of them separately, then our freedom is coming separately as well. And we've got this. I remember once, the first time I ever had, I think it was, they make vanilla cherry Coke, I think. And I tasted it one time, and I remember saying it's so strange because I can taste the vanilla and the cherry and the Coke, and they're all separate tastes. So that's the way the traditional version would have it, right? We experience the matzah, whatever that involves, and the maror, and the Pesach. And Hillel says his understanding of the verses is they have to come together. And that, again, I think shapes our Shulchan Orech, because remember, our Shulchan Orech, our dinner, when we would not have had the Pesach, right? When would we have had the Korban Pesach? We wouldn't have had it at dinner. We would have had it after dinner. Korban Pesach is the last thing we eat that night. So at the dinner, when we are busily re-experiencing our freedom, do we experience it in sort of flashes of memory of different types? There's freedom memory, there's slavery memory, there's this memory, right? Do we do that? Or is it supposed to come together in a unified whole? And for Hillel, that's what I think he's saying. And that's why there are some versions that he put the matzah in there as well. And the idea is to eat the matzah and the Pesach and the maror and to combine the memory of slavery with the memory of the moment of, or the re-experiencing of the moment of being set free, with the sense of freedom, of leaving to freedom so quickly we couldn't let it rise, and put it all together in one memory. And that would mean, again, that at our meals, what are we feeling at our meals? And I think it's very hard to do. So I keep talking about it because it's not the kind of thing I can give you a specific guideline for. It's an emotion. It's a sensibility. It's a feel. It's what our context is. So I might be in the same dining room I've been in for many Shabbatot and for many Yom Tovim, but Pesach night, that dining room is supposed to be where I'm thinking to myself, wow, I just left Egypt. That's unbelievable. That's not such an easy thing to do. And Hillel is saying that within that experience, it's not only the experience of having gotten out, it's not only that joy, it's that joy mixed with, I think, wonder at the moment of freedom that came with the Pesach and the midnight and the God killing all the firstborn, and that in a moment things happening. Meaning the Jewish people who had gotten this Pesach, the Pesach sacrifice, and prepared it 4 days before the holiday, and they're in their homes on that first Seder night ever. The Egyptians, until midnight, had no intention of letting the Jews go free. And so the Jews are in their room, are in their houses, and they know that God has told them they're going free tomorrow, and they're packed and they're ready. But it'd be an odd thing to think about. What makes me think that I'm going to go free tomorrow? So that's the Korban Pesach, and then you mix it with the Gemara in this. So that would all sort of play out in how we experience the Shulchan Orech. And number 8, Shulchan Orech says, Makom shenagu. Now more food about the Pesach meal itself. So this is based on the Gemara, but he says there were places, Makom shenagu lechol tzli b'leilei psachim ochlim. Some people ate roasted meat on Pesach night. Now, is that really a problem? It's not really a problem because the Pesach sacrifice, while it was roasted meat, only came off of a whole roasted lamb or a whole roasted goat. So if I buy, a rib roast, which is a roast, the kind of roast you put in a pot and you cook, and I eat it roasted, it's not really anything problem. But some places, my own family custom is not to have meat like that because it looks too much like it could be a Korban Pesach. Right? Because the worry is it might look like the Pesach sacrifice. But you definitely can't have a lamb if the whole lamb was roasted together, right? A lamb or a kid was roasted together. Now, the truth is, even if I did that, and I don't know why I would, but let's imagine that a Jew today were to buy a live lamb, a live goat, and find a shochet, find a ritual slaughterer, he'll slaughter it, he'll get it ready in the way it is, and the guy rotisseries it. So it's not allowed. The custom is not to do it. But the custom is only not to do it because it looks like, it's not actually having the Pesach sacrifice because you didn't intend it as a sacrifice, you didn't offer it as a sacrifice. But the answer is, it looks too much like we're offering sacrifices outside. Now, when we do that, I know when I was growing up, my mother every year made fricassee because my father, Allah Shalom, my father, should rest in peace, he was from a family where they thought that even roast chicken was too much of a problem, which is not really such a big real problem because chicken isn't a plausible candidate for the sacrifice anyway. But it meant I wasn't a big fan of fricassee. So it meant that at our Pesach Seder meal, I'm being reminded. So one thing we're trying to remind ourselves of is that we just went free. But another thing we're reminding ourselves is we're not where we could be because we're not yet offering a Pesach sacrifice. Now, the Shulchan Orech says, if you cut off a piece of the animal, right, or it's cut up, that's going to be allowed if it's the custom, because the original Pesach sacrifice was not allowed to be cut up. Right? You had to roast the animal whole, and you sliced pieces off of the animal, but that was it. You couldn't break off a leg or anything like that. And the Ramah says, and this is something that I think about at Shulchan Orech a lot because it comes up, right? Don't eat or drink too much. Because you got to make sure that the idea about the achila gasa in halacha is that if I'm too full, my eating can't count as a mitzvah. So I've been at Seders where, when you get around to the afikom, people say, oh, no, more matzah, I'm too full. And the Ramah is saying, you're supposed to pace yourselves. We're supposed to pace ourselves. We're not supposed to be too full. It's another Shulchan Orech thing to think of, that the entire time we're eating at Shulchan Orech, we have to make sure that as we eat, we're leaving room. We have to keep it in mind. That's another Shulchan Orech, right? This is our topic tonight, right? And the same thing with our drinking, right? You have to make sure, yishtaker v'yashin miyad. We want to make sure that we don't drink so much that it puts us to sleep. And so, it's Seder's like that as well, where the wine helps people fall asleep. They have to, again, pace themselves. And you have to know yourself and know you're tolerant to this, to that. So now the Mishnah Berurah points out on this idea of achila gasa, right? That you can't be now. Achila gasa in halacha means two possibilities. One idea of achila gasa is that I'm so full, I really can't eat anything else. It's just annoying to eat anything else. When people reach that level, the food they eat after that doesn't count as eating in halacha. So much so, it's very hard to get to this level. But so much so, if one were that full on Yom Kippur and ate, they would not have fully violated Yom Kippur because it's not really eating an halacha. But the Mishnah Berurah says that when the Ramah warns us to make sure that we should pace ourselves as we eat, so we don't end up eating an achila gasa, he says, Dainu, sheino mitavek la le'echol. He thinks it's the much lower level of achila gasa. If I just get so full that I have no real interest in eating anymore, not that I feel like I'm going to explode, I'm just not interested. I'll do it. I'm not interested. That's a problem. That's not the ideal way to perform the mitzvah. And the truth is, we eat the afikomen to commemorate the Pesach sacrifice. And we ate the Pesach sacrifice after a meal. The ideal was that we shouldn't be terribly hungry when we're eating it. And right, that's why we eat after the meal. Komi says to the Mishnah Berurah is telling us we have to have a little bit of room in us. Now, I've been at Pesach Seders where people eat the meal itself with gusto, and they have dessert, right? And then comes the afikom, and they're like, oh, I'm so full. But the Mishnah Berurah and the Ramah are telling us that's a challenge in your Shulchan Orech. So if I'm giving you elements of Shulchan Orech that I'm trying to think could be valuable for our meal, one is our attitude, our physical presentation, leaning, our sense of ourselves, of having now gone free is another, right? Our question of leaning or not leaning in terms of whether that's forcing us to express or feel the freedom that we had, right? Then the question of what does our sense of freedom look like? Is it a mix and it all putting all together, the Pesach matzah and the maror, or each of them separately? And now another element of the meal is that as we eat, being careful to eat in such a way that we still leave room for an excited and engaged experience of the afikomen. And if we don't have that, so it's not ideal, right? And then he says, and if you're so hungry, so full that you just can't imagine eating anymore, he says it's not clear. This is a complicated issue, but it's not clear that you fulfill the mitzvah even, because that kind of eating, right? That kind of achila is not really called achila, not called eating in Allah. So that's another element of our Shulchan Orech. That the Shulchan Orech is number 10. Like I mentioned before, the truth is even for birds, right, or large animals like beef, right, which is not from an animal that could have been offered as a Pesach sacrifice, as long as it's the kind of food that one is not allowed to eat it until it was ritually slaughtered. At shechita, you can't eat it roasted in the places where, like I said, our family custom not to have even chicken because there was a custom like that. The Ramah says in the second line, number 10, no, I can make beitzim, right? Some places have the custom to eat eggs at the meal, and the eggs at the meal is to commemorate the Avelus in the morning. That's another element of our Shulchan Orech now. So I'm trying to help us build up a sense of what that meal is all about, because I've certainly been at Sedarim where there's no sense of what the meal is about. So now we're finding out the meal is about that sense of having just gone free. But even as I said, I've just gone free, having some element of remembering that what I went free from had bitterness to it, had sadness to it, and not dropping that, not losing sight of that. We're supposed to remember that. Remember the tradition that a sizable percentage of Jewish people got left behind in Egypt. I talked about some of these issues in a book that I wrote a few years ago called As If We Were There. So you have a few days if you want to get it, but I talk about some of these issues. So for example, there's this Rashi who presents the Midrash that says that only 1/5 of Jews left Egypt. So that bitterness of loss is part of the experience as well. And here too, the loss of the Beit HaMikdash, the fact that we're at a Pesach Seder. Thank God many of us are well, and it seems like this might be a year when finally the pandemic won't really take away from our Sedarim in significant ways. People are being able to go to a place where they used to go. Israel is getting more people as they used to. All of that is for the good. All of that is great. And yet, we're supposed to remember we don't actually have a Korban Pesach sacrifice. So where our menu is, can't have, for many people, can't have chicken, can't have roast chicken, right? Can't have roast chicken, can't have roast veal, because Pesach night, we should have been having lamb or goat, lamb or kid. So that, and then we eat eggs to remind us of that as well. But nireli, mishum shelel, now the Ramah says, nireli, mishum shelel tisha b'av, nikba belil pesach. The way the Jewish calendar is set up, it is always true. Now, this wasn't true. This is another way, by the way, that it reminds us we're not in the time of the Beit HaMikdash. Because in the time of the temple, the calendar is set by witnesses coming to court. We have a fixed calendar. In our fixed calendar, so then the night that Pesach is, the night of the week that Pesach is always the same night of the week as Tisha B'Av will be. So this year, that means that the Tisha B'Av is going to be on a Friday night, so we'll have it on Saturday night instead. And also to commemorate the Korban. Okay, fine. Some people don't dip it. My family always had the eggs in salt water to also enhance the commemoration. There must have some people have the custom not do that because we wanted to have two dippings because of what we said in Manishtana. Okay. Mishnah Berurah on, you don't have chicken meat or veal. Even though you can't have a Korban Pesach from them, we still don't do it because people won't notice. People see roast and they think roast, or they think this. So that's why we do it. So we're being extra careful to be sure that nobody gets the wrong impression about what we're eating and not think that we think the Beit HaMikdash is still around or that we offer the sacrifice. The Aruch HaShulchan, so the Mishnah Berurah and the Aruch HaShulchan lived right around the same time. They lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and right around the same time, they're publishing like renewed or redone codes of Jewish law. The Shulchan Orech published his code of Jewish law in the late 1500s, 1565. The Ramah, soon after that, wrote his glosses, where he gave you the Ashkenazic view of it. And then like 300 years later, they were updating it as it were, redoing it. So the Aruch HaShulchan says, number 12, isur chal gam al zara, right? That, let's say I said to myself, you know what, I want to have veal at my Seder, and I don't think this is a necessary custom. So the Aruch HaShulchan says it's not the way it works. The custom of the Pesach Seder is the customs that you went from your forefathers. And that's true of custom in general, but he makes the point here. So I'm going to go on for a bit and I'll come back to this, but think about, why does he make the point here? Why is it particularly the Pesach Seder? And I think it's relevant to the things that I've been saying tonight. That's why I make the point of it. Why is it particularly relevant to the Pesach Seder to say, you know what? However your forefathers did the Seder, that's the custom you have to continue to the extent that you can, especially in terms of this issue. Then number 13, he says, Slikidar is like a pot roast. You put it in a pot, but there's no water. So roasting in halacha is not in a pot. Roasting in halacha is just open to the flame. So you have something that's in a pot, but there's no water. So water in halakha is necessary for cooking. So tzli kedar, pot roast is sort of in between. So he says, I think maybe you can have it on Pesach because the korban Pesach could never be brought from that. Now, they'll tell me that the korban Pesach, the Pesach sacrifice, couldn't be brought from chicken either. It's true, but his point was that roast chicken doesn't look so different from roast veal or roast lamb, is what his point was. You can argue, but that was his point. But pot roast, that is already just a completely different version of cooking, and therefore he thinks it's okay, because not it's okay. Gam bitzlao ve'acharkach bishlo, right? So then he says, also, by the way, that would mean if I wanted to roast meat on a rotisserie, right, really roast it over the fire, and then boil it in water, right, for a little while. So now it can't be korban pesach because it's not just roasted. I think that's okay, right, as long as it's possible in the korban pesach. So that focus on the pesach sacrifice, I think, is crucial. So I raised the question before: why would it be so vital in terms of Pesach itself? And I think the answer might be what we said at the beginning here. If we in our generation are supposed to see ourselves as if we left Egypt, right? So, are just now. So, what's the way that we make our Seder look maximally like we're the generation that left? So, I think the answer is the more that we have our Seder be as close to what we had going before us as we can, the more that we're part of that history and we're inserting ourselves into that history. That's what I think. That's what I think it's suggesting. Okay. Now, in number 16, right, even those who don't eat roast anything, you can eat roast fish or you can eat roasted eggs because they're not anything like meat. And therefore, you're allowed to do that. Now, not the roasted egg on the Seder plate because that was put aside for, that looks like it's commemorating a korban. But, and then he reminds us not to eat too much, right? So we keep the korban, the afikoman. Yeah, so that's what I want to get from the Aruch HaShulchan. Except that he reminds us of Chachamim Abirosho. It's a phrase from Mishlei, from Kohelet, from somewhere in Scripture, right? And it means that part of wisdom is looking ahead. So I'm getting to the meal. I should be figuring this out. And that, by the way, plays into also, the size of the wine glasses you have. Now, some people can drink wine and they're not affected by it at all. Okay. Some people, when they drink wine and they get affected, A, it puts them to sleep, and B, it fills them up. So then get a smaller glass or get a wine that doesn't do it. And then you come to the meal. So many Sederim that I've been at, there's a soup and an egg and a main course and a dessert be careful. Plan out our eating. And that's true also. I'm sorry, I wanted to say also, when it comes to the matzah, right? We have 2 kizetim of matzah for motzi, right? For motzi and matzah. And then we have another kizai, another olive's worth at korech. So when you're thinking about how much to have for matzah, so there they put out these amounts, right? So some Sederim I have said, okay, but I have a little more just in case. That's fine unless it fills you up, because then you lose it out at the end. So being stringent in one area might be a leniency or might lead to problems in another area. And then he says, I think it's crucial and important, and the Seder is supposed to be a time of great joy. Now, some people have joy like they just have a fun. The joy that he means is the joy of getting to this point where we're re-experiencing the Exodus and we're saying, oh, I just left Egypt. If I and my family were in slavery for 210 years, that's the joy we're talking about. It's not just joy like I'm having a good time. It's a particular kind of joy, and that's what I think he's talking about. Okay, just a couple more points, and then we'll be done with what the Shulchan Orech can look like. I found a book online. I found a book called The Migdanot Eliyahu by a man named Rabbi Alter Eliyahu, which I feel like we were there. Why did forbid to eat roast meat? I'm sorry. The roast meat problem is not about being there or not being there. The roast meat problem is that the roast meat is from a Pesach sacrifice. And that we don't have, because that can only be done in Jerusalem, in a rebuilt Jerusalem. So that's the other piece of it, right? In our Shulchan Orech, the custom is not to have that roast meat because it would indicate that it's as if we're in Jerusalem and we have a temple, and that's really not allowed, right? So that's something that we have lost until such times we get it back, the experience of sacrifices. So you're right. I hear the tension. You're saying, well, if I'm pretending I'm back in Egypt, they were allowed to have a sacrifice. but that was because it was before the Beit HaMikdash, before the temple was built. Once the temple got built, so then you couldn't do it anymore. And then you could only have sacrifices in Jerusalem. And even as we have our meals, some of us are fortunate enough to be having our meals in Jerusalem. It's not the rebuilt Jerusalem that we're still longing for. But a very good question. And I hope that's clear. And if it wasn't clear, please ask it again. But that's the challenge, that's the tension there, that the actual sacrifice. Okay, good. Book, Migdal Eliyahu, Rabbi Alter Eliyahu, I'm number 18 now. Rabbi Alter Eliyahu Halevi Rubenstein was a rabbi in the Shomer HaChomos neighborhood of Yerushalayim. Then he moved to Antwerp in Belgium, I think it should, right? And there, and he died in 2005, and his book was published posthumously. So he has response in his response. He says, "V'yesh lomar, to tell you b'masha ari chatani as a father-in-law, shebeleil seder, gama kiddush b'hasiuda dinam ka'achilat matzah, benitfalim la shematzah hikar hasiuda." His family tradition, his father-in-law's tradition was that really matzah is what the Seder is about. Now, why would matzah be what the Seder is about? Matzah is what the Seder is about because matzah is the bread that we said before we had back in Egypt in one way. And then when we left Egypt, it took on a whole new character. And in telling the story of how matzah changes into the matzah of the bread of the freedom, the bread of symbolizing the moment, the rush, the excited rush, the joyful rush to leave Egypt, that's the Pesach Seder in a nutshell. But the point that he's making is, and the meal is supposed to be subordinate, also the wine, but the meal is supposed to be subordinate to that. Now, he doesn't mean subordinate in terms of actual foods, he means subordinate in terms of experience. So it means that my Shulchan Orech should be an experience of extending that matzah experience, which is, I'm not laying out easy things to do. I'm laying out the challenge of having that meal be really what it could be and should be. So the Yalkut Yosef, which is by the current Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, in number 20, he says, Yarok Shulchano v'yisad b'simcha, you set your table and you eat with joy, ki yad Hashem hatovah. An important point, the meal is supposed to sort of reflect God's blessings in our lives. And if you lean, it's even better. Notice that he doesn't say it's absolutely required, I think because he knows that Rav Yah. And so it's not completely clear that you have to lean. And wise people will make sure to eat in a way they won't get too full. They can eat the afikomen with some kind of excitement about it and not be overstuffed and it not be a pain for them. And then he says, okay, so he thinks that if you're leaning while you're eating, then you got to make sure not to talk too much, because talking while eating, especially when leaning, is particularly dangerous. But nonetheless, at the meal, even while leaning, you have to be careful, but you can talk about, even though we wouldn't normally talk while eating, you can talk about the Exodus. So he's already suggesting what I think is true, that, imagine if, and I've known people like this who, let's say they're saved from a plane crash. So they get home and they start to eat. What would they talk about? What else would they talk about? They talk about the plane crash. So when we get to Shulchan Orech, I always wonder about it because, in fairness to people, it's been a long time. They've spoken a lot about the Seder. Maybe they're out of energy. But I think it's, right, you would say bracha gomel for sure. You make a bracha to celebrate your salvation. But you'd also talk about the event. It would be like inescapable. And then I was doing this, and I was doing that, and this happened, that happened, and I couldn't believe it. We don't know the details of Yisrael Chaim so well to do that. But that's really ideally what's going on. Right? We just got out of Egypt. Remember when back in Egypt we did this and this and this? Right? So we can't do that because we weren't physically back in Egypt. But if we're trying to get to that stage, that's what the meal could really involve. And that would be a reason why the laws of Korban Pesach, the laws of Pesach, could substitute for that, because they give us a guideline, as we've spoken about tonight, let's say. Just thinking about the matzah, considering the matzah, and talking about the matzah, and talking about what the matzah does for us, that would shape a meal in a certain way. And the last source for tonight, and I did it a little bit quicker than I meant to, and I apologize again because I was late. I apologize for things getting out of hand, but there's a journal called Mivakshei Torah, and there's Rabbi Moshe Mendel Brus, who I don't know, but it's from, this is from 2007, but I don't know who he is. He says the meal is part of the Seder, is not just a yontif meal. And I've been at many, many meals where the meal is really just a holiday meal. You have the holiday food, which is nice, and everybody enjoys it, and everybody's in their holiday finest, but that's not really what it is. It's a meal about part of the Seder. You're supposed to eat, and he says all the things I said tonight, to eat not eat certain foods, to be aware that we're eating to leave room for the afikoman. And as his father said, all the eating of the Seder is connected to the matzah, right? Why we can't have, and that's why we, for example, don't have Kiddush Seder night until the stars come out, because the mitzvah eating matzah is only once the stars come out. And we know that the Kiddush is connected to the matzah. So what you end up having if I think about Shulchan Orech, about that meal, I feel like, and I worry, that it's often a neglected element because it's freer, it's less shaped, it's less specifically defined as opposed to other parts of the Seder. And it leaves room for it to devolve into an ordinary Yom Tov meal. And what I'm hoping that we saw tonight is there are all sorts of ways that the halacha gently nudges us to make this meal be more than that, be something that's a vital part of the Seder. And a part of the Seder, that it's our time to live out what we spent the previous part of the night building up in ourselves, that experience, that sense. It comes with, as somebody pointed out earlier, it comes with a certain tinge of a little bit of sadness that we're not able to actually have the Pesach sacrifice. We have to make do with matzah for the afikoman. We have to make sure not to eat, for those in various places where the custom is, but not to eat certain foods because we don't have the Pesach we don't have an actual Pesach sacrifice. But within that context, we have matzah, and we have the 4 cups of wine expressing our freedom, and we have the leaning that we do to make sure that we make clear of it. And with all of that, I hope we can find our ways as we eat carefully and making sure to leave room for the afikoman at the end to really enjoy the afikoman as well, that we manage to have a Shulchan Orech that really does all of the goals, fulfills all the goals that we wanted to fulfill. So that's my presentation. That's my thoughts about Shulchan Orech as the WebYeshiva takes you through the parts of the Seder. I hope that was productive and helpful for everybody. I'm happy to take questions, but I'm going to stop the recording now, and I'm happy to take questions if anybody has. So thanks for joining us, and Chag Kosher V'Sameach to everybody. Thanks.